Hello, my name is Christoph Bernau from the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems at UC Santa Cruz. Today we're going to talk about seedling propagation mixes and the qualities that one is looking for when you either purchase a mix or if you make your own mixes. We'll also talk about some of the raw ingredients that provide the characteristics and qualities that you're looking for, and then we will take a look at some mixes, the same mix in a wet state, a dry state, and sort of a just right for use state. So when we think about mixes, we think about several different things as being really imperative in the mix you make. We need to be able to provide drainage and aeration and simultaneously moisture retention. We also need to have a pathogen-free environment, and we need to think about provisioning for fertility to help the seedlings develop. So, why are these different ingredients important and how do they go together? Drainage is critical because we want excess moisture when we water. We want excess moisture to move out of the mix. And for the structure of the mix to provide for aeration, this is critical because the pore space in your mix, if it is entirely filled with water because it doesn't drain well, this can create an inhospitable environment for your seedling roots and ultimately welcome in fungal pathogens. So drainage being critical, and then that goes hand in hand with aeration, so that the pore space after watering and after excess water drains away, a percentage of that is refilled by oxygen, dissolved oxygen in the mix. But then obviously we also don't want to have to be watering all the time, so we also need moisture retention. We need ingredients that will hold some water while shedding excess water. And those are sort of the critical things in terms of the structural elements. The disease-free or pathogen-free environment is really important. We don't want weed seeds in there because those weed seedlings can compete with our plants for nutrients and just for growing space in the mix. And then we also want a pathogen-free environment where there's no pre-existing fungal pathogens, the damping off organisms in particular, that could kill our just emerging seed and young seedlings. The other aspect to this that relates to drainage, aeration, retention is that that's critical so that we're not creating a welcoming environment for fungal pathogens to move in and then ultimately bring down the seedlings that we're trying to grow. Finally, we have to think about soil fertility. And soil fertility can be provisioned in one of two principal ways. It can be part of the ingredients that go into your mix. For example, compost might be a resource for fertility for you, or you may use organic granular fertilizers that are going to be available to your crop within the life cycle in the containers that they're growing. Or we would think about providing fertility by way of some sort of supplemental source, usually delivered, say, with a fertilizer injector, where we take a liquid nutrient and then as we are watering, as the seedlings develop, we're actually providing a water-soluble nutrient source. And that could be any number of things. In our case, we would typically use something like a fish emulsion and perhaps kelp combined together. But there are many different ways that folks go about this. So I think I'll take a look now at some of the different ingredients and the qualities that they impart. These are ingredients that you might choose if you're blending your own mix, or ingredients that many of these are ingredients that you will commonly find in mixes that you would purchase. So here we have two different vermiculites. Vermiculite is a micaceous rock. It's a mined rock. It's a non-renewable resource. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to extract it from the ground and then to process it to the point where it's really useful as a propagation ingredient. Not sustainable, but widely used in horticulture and agriculture because of the properties that it imparts. The vermiculite is excellent at retaining moisture while simultaneously draining or shedding excess moisture. And then with that then comes really good aeration in a mix. The coarser medium vermiculite that you see here, this particular one would often be blended directly into a propagation or a mix that maybe is for perennial container plants and such. Something like this finer vermiculite here, which is a smaller particle size, this is usually not blended into mixes, but many growers will use this as a top dressing after they've sown their crop. They will use the fine vermiculite to cover their seed. We like this, growers like this, because it holds moisture and simultaneously allows for good aeration around the seed. And then when seeds germinate, it's very easy for them to push up and through this. So very, very useful, though not sustainable ingredients. Perlite is similar in many of those regards. Excellent for drainage and aeration, and moderately good at soil or at moisture retention as well. Also a non-sustainable ingredient. This is a mined volcanic rock, only comes from a few different deposits around the world, much like the vermiculite. Tremendous energy involved in the extraction and processing of this. And for better or for worse, probably mostly for worse, this is used almost universally in horticulture and agriculture. In our case, all of these non-sustainable ingredients, we do rely on them, but we try to maximize their utility and in many cases even recycle them from one crop to the next when we don't have issues around pathogens being transferred from one crop to the next. Another ingredient that is essentially a mined ingredient is peat moss, coming from northern bogs in the northern hemisphere. Peat moss is an excellent resource for drainage and moisture retention, and fairly valuable also for aeration. However, peat moss is being produced, it's a very, very slow process of decomposition in an anaerobic environment, and we are harvesting it at a sort of a human pace, and it is used widely in agriculture. And as a result, at some point, we will probably no longer have peat moss as a resource. But in the meantime, it is almost universally found in mixes. One of the primary substitutes that has been available for quite a number of years now is cocoa peat. So cocoa peat, or sometimes called coir, is ground up coconut hulls. So in this respect, it's a little bit, I would say it's a little bit more sustainable than peat moss because it is being produced on an annual basis rather than over much more lengthy time to produce the true peat. Similar in terms of qualities, cocoa peat provides drainage reasonably well, but especially provides moisture retention and provides reasonable to also really good aeration in the mix. It's a little bit harder to process coming out of the bags than the peat moss. It's to break it apart and blend it into a mix. A little bit more labor involved in that, but it's an ingredient that I'm hoping that over time we're going to be able to see more detailed analysis, sort of life cycle analysis of what it really takes from harvest through use for both of these ingredients so that we can universally have a better understanding of what is the environmental footprint of using these two ingredients. Because at this point it's not entirely well understood. Another ingredient that is commonly found in mixes that we like but has some drawbacks to it is sand. Obviously, sand exists all over the world and is in great abundance. The one sand you might want to avoid is a beach sand because that's going to typically be salty, but river sand and such is typically the type of sand that would be found in a mix. Really good for drainage and aeration. The main drawback is simply that it is physically very heavy. It's just broken down rock, whereas all of these other ingredients are very, very lightweight, even when moist, and that makes for much easier handling and transport and movement into the greenhouse, out of the greenhouse, and into the field of your seedlings. Sand is really valuable, but it is heavy, so there's more labor involved and more even fuel involved in transporting mixes that have sand in them. One of the ingredients that is commonly used in mixes as a resource for fertility would be a high-quality compost. Now, we like compost because it does provision for some nutrients, and then it also retains moisture really well. Not quite as good at drainage and aeration, but still useful in those regards too. In lieu of compost as a fertility source, folks use things like feather meal, blood meal, many other mineral resources and or byproducts are used. The biggest thing to be aware of is whatever materials might be blended into your mix, are they readily available? Many young seedlings are only going to be in a container for 3-4 weeks to maybe 6-8 weeks maximum. And will the nutrients that you're provisioning actually become available so that the plants can utilize them? That's a critical thing to be aware of and assessing for. Some other alternatives, other things that I just want to point out, depending on where you live and where you're growing, you might have access to leaf mold. This is basically just composted leaf litter, in this case from our local coast live oaks. So that might be, if you're going to make your own mixes, some sort of leaf mold might be a sustainable and renewable resource that you could be producing yourself and are harvesting locally. Actually functions very similarly to the way that the peat moss functions. Great drainage and aeration and moisture retention. All of those things come in good supply with something like leaf mold. Something we've experimented with and used for many years here is Grape Pomace. This is essentially a local ingredient because there's an extensive wine industry in our area. And this is basically just composted, the composted byproduct from pressing the grapes to make wine. So we have the seeds, and then we have the fines from what's left over from the pulp and the skins. And this provides us a little bit of nutrients and provides pretty good drainage and aeration and moisture retention without being too heavy. So that's another, potential type of thing. If you look at the resources that are available in your area, are there ingredients, if you're wanting to make your own mixes, are there ingredients that you might be able to use that are a byproduct of another industry that's in your immediate area? The last thing we're going to highlight today is soil. The soil that you would extract from your garden or from your field. In traditional mixes, the standard recipe for a traditional mix would be 1/3 compost, 1/3 sand, 1/3 soil, and that can work reasonably well. You get the lightness and openness, relatively speaking, from the sand and the compost, and you get some bulk density. You get some micronutrients from the soil. But soil is a problematic ingredient. Like sand, it's very heavy, and even the best quality in-ground soils were not really intended or designed to occupy a lot of space in a container. And this is an example. This was soil that was in a 4-inch pot that's been repeatedly wetted and then dried down and wetted. And what happens over time is it turns into a solid, hard clod with virtually no pore space, nowhere for roots to go, no aeration, and this can be really problematic. So while I think that soil is a great ingredient, I would always be cautious of using it at more than maybe 15 or 20% of the total volume in your mix so that you don't get this type of situation developing. All of these ingredients are valuable tools for growing your seedlings. And the question really ultimately becomes, what is the combination and proportion of them that gives you that balance of drainage, aeration, retention? How am I provisioning for nutrients? am I confident that I have a pathogen-free environment? Now we're going to talk a little bit about finished soil mixes and what they look like in a very dry state, a just about right moisture state, and in a too wet state, and why it's important to be in this middle ground when you're sowing and growing seedlings. The mix that we're looking at here is from a local supplier that we purchased in 50 cubic foot tote bags. So we're able to bring in a large volume all at once. It is comprised principally of peat moss, composted redwood bark, perlite, and then it also has a granular fertilizer source blended in that's organically acceptable and provides abundant nutrients to fuel the development of our crops in the time frame that they are actually in the containers before going out into the field. So let's take a look here at dry, just about right, and too wet. You can see the very, very light color and maybe sort of the dusty nature of this one here. One of the ways I'm going to think about assessing for soil moisture is obviously just looking at the color, but then the same way I might take a ball of soil out in the field to assess for soil moisture, I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to take a handful, I'm going to give it a squeeze, and then I'm going to let go. And you can see the dust flying off of it, and you can see it doesn't hold together in a soil ball at all. Really dry like this is not going to be appropriate for seed germination and seedling development. There's really no available moisture here to fuel development. In this middle ground or sort of just right ground, you can see a little bit darker color. And if I pull it up and try to make a soil ball out of it, it basically holds together, despite the fact that this is really fluffy, lightweight ingredients with the composted bark, peat moss, and perlite. At this stage, this is just about right for seeds to be able to imbibe moisture to germinate and to fuel root development to supply nutrients and water to the roots. That soil ball didn't leave really any residue on my hand, no marks, just as about right soil moisture would leave little to no moisture on your hand. If we compare that now to this same mix that is in the very wet stage, if I take a handful of this and I squeeze this, you're going to see there's free water running out of it. Excess moisture running out of it. It certainly makes a ball, but you can see it leaves all kinds of material all over my hands and moisture impression on my hands. Why is this problematic in this stage? Well, too much moisture means that water is actually going to be excluding oxygen from the pore space, and really our roots want to have a balance of available moisture and available oxygen to really optimize development. This, in time, this will certainly drain back down, but we just watered this heavy to sort of illustrate what it looks like when it's too wet. One other thing I want to just discuss is how do I go from this dry state to this just right state? When I'm thinking about bringing moisture up, if I've got, say, a mix that I've made that's sat and dried down, I am going to add water very gradually because many of our ingredients, but especially ingredients like peat moss and cocoa peat, are what are referred to as hydrophobic. When they are dry, they will repel moisture initially, despite the fact that they actually hold moisture very, very well. So I'm going to want to slowly add water, mix the mix, bring that moisture up, try to get the water evenly distributed, and go from the dry state to just about the right moisture state. One thing that's challenging is because of that hydrophobic nature, oftentimes I'll be handling a mix and I'm like, it's still a little too dry, a little more water, a little too dry, a little more water. And then next thing I know, I've overdone it and I've got too wet of a mix that I'm now going to have to sit and wait to use because it's really too wet to handle and could compact and condense and such. That is simply to say that as you're going from dry to just right, add water gradually, stir it in, wait a little bit, let it be absorbed. If need be, add a little bit more, but do it sort of stepwise and conservatively rather than adding a whole bunch of moisture all at once, which may push you too far or not being patient enough and you think you're not quite there because moisture hasn't sort of worked its way through the whole mix, and then you add more water and all of a sudden you're at this overly wet stage. In this middle ground here, I'm going to have drainage, aeration. I've still got good moisture retention to meet the plant's needs. And then, you know, as we've looked at, this mix is going to provide my fertility. And because of the ingredients that are in it, it is also a pathogen-free mix.